You wake up and there is no sun. Not the gray overcast of a winter morning. Not the pale light that filters through clouds before noon. Nothing. The sky above you is the color of ash. A milky, dead haze that sits over everything like a lid placed over the world. You have seen this sky every morning for months. You have stopped waiting for it to change. The air hits your face before you are fully upright. It is cold in a way that feels wrong for the season. Your body knows it. Your hands know it before your mind does. You reach for the fire before you do anything else. Not to warm yourself, but because without it, the morning does not begin. The fire is not comfort, it is a function. The house around you is small. Timber, mud, and thatch. One room where everything happens. Sleeping, eating, storing what little there is to store. The walls hold the smoke from last night's fire. Your eyes adjust slowly. There is not much to see. A clay pot. Some cloth. A pile of straw in the corner where the youngest ones sleep. You count them before you count anything else. Outside, the ground is frozen in a way it should not be in late spring. The soil under your feet is hard and unyielding. The garden plot, the strip of earth that is supposed to feed your household from one season to the next, shows no growth. You planted 2 weeks ago. Nothing has pushed through. You planted 3 weeks before that. The seeds rotted in the ground. You already know what this means. You have known for longer than you want to admit. But today, like every day, you pick up your tools and you go back to that ground anyway. Because stopping is not something you know how to do yet. Something is wrong with the year 536 AD, and it is not going to fix itself. The world did not warn anyone. It simply changed. The sun kept rising, technically, but the warmth stopped arriving. A veil of volcanic ash, suspended in the upper atmosphere from an eruption no one on the ground witnessed, had already done its work. The year became the coldest in the last 2,000 years. Then the next year was colder. Then the one after that. This is not a story about a disaster. It is a story about what happens when the one thing every civilization assumed was permanent turns out to be fragile. You are a farmer in the late Roman world, or what is left of it. The Western Empire has been dead for 60 years. The Eastern Empire, ruled from Constantinople, still functions. It has laws, armies, grain distribution networks, tax collectors. You know the emperor's name. You do not know much else about him. What you know is the land you work, the lord above you, and the obligation that connects the two. You do not own the land, you work it. In exchange, you receive the right to remain on it, to shelter your family on it, and to keep a portion of what you produce. The rest goes up the chain, to a local landowner, then to administrators, then to the state. This system is not new. It was built over centuries to extract maximum output from agricultural labor while keeping the laborers alive enough to produce. You are, in the logic of this structure, an input. The system works when harvests are reliable. They are no longer reliable. The agricultural calendar that governs your life is precise. Planting windows are narrow. The relationship between temperature, moisture, and soil productivity is not something you understand scientifically. But your body has learned it through repetition, through what your parents taught you and what their parents taught them. When to plant wheat, when to plant rye, when the frost is past, when the soil is ready. That knowledge, accumulated across generations, is now useless. The frost is not passing. The soil is not warming. The calendar tells you it is spring. The ground tells you otherwise. This matters in ways that go beyond your household. The entire regional food supply is built on the assumption that this year's harvest will follow the pattern of last year's. Storage exists for short disruptions. A bad harvest, a wet season, a localized flood. There is no storage protocol for 3 consecutive years of failure across an entire continent. The system was never designed for this. And because it was never designed for it, it has no mechanism for surviving it. Now that you understand the structure you live inside, the next question is the one your body has been asking since dawn. What does staying alive inside a broken system actually cost? The land does not produce, but the obligation does not stop. This is the first pressure that will break you. Not hunger, not cold, but the arithmetic of extraction in a world where there is nothing left to extract. Your tax obligation is fixed. It was set in normal times, and normal times are over, but the calculation has not changed. Grain, labor, service, whatever form the obligation takes, it is owed. When the harvest fails, the debt does not disappear. It defers, accumulates, and earns interest in the form of additional labor or confiscated assets. Peasant communities across the late antique world leave traces of this pressure in the archaeological record. Storage pits emptied earlier than expected. Livestock bones found in unexpected contexts. Animals slaughtered not at the end of their productive lives, but at the beginning of winter, before the owners could be certain there was enough feed to sustain them. Households that downsized abruptly. Villages that shrank in layers. The material evidence of people making decisions under conditions where every option was a form of loss. You sell what you should not sell. You eat what you plan to plant. You borrow from neighbors who have slightly more, creating obligations that will outlast the crisis. The Lord above you applies pressure in the form of representatives who arrive at your door and inventory what remains. You cannot refuse them entry. You cannot explain your way out of what you owe. You can reduce your own household's consumption to a level that allows you to meet the obligation. And that is what most people do. They do not default. They starve quietly instead, in degrees, over months. But even if you manage to satisfy the debt today, the field is still empty. By the second failed season, hunger is not an event. It is a condition. There is a difference between not having enough to eat and the specific physiology of prolonged caloric deficit. In the first weeks, your body is resourceful. It draws on fat reserves, adjusts its metabolic rate, finds ways to continue functioning. By the second month, those reserves are depleted. The body begins consuming muscle tissue. Work output drops. You move more slowly. You think more slowly. The cognitive decline that accompanies sustained malnutrition is well documented. Decision-making degrades. Emotional regulation weakens. The capacity for planning shortens to the immediate moment. This matters because survival in this world requires planning. It requires anticipating the next season, managing what little remains, organizing collective effort. Hunger systematically dismantles the mental infrastructure that makes those things possible. Communities under famine conditions begin making decisions that appear irrational from the outside and are entirely logical from the inside. Eating seed grain, slaughtering breeding animals, abandoning fields that are not yet fully dead because the energy cost of tending them exceeds the expected return. Chronicles from the period, Byzantine, Syriac, Chinese, begin changing their language around 536. Descriptions of harvests disappear. Descriptions of prices appear instead. Grain at 4 times its normal value, then 8 times, then simply noted as unavailable. Markets that functioned on surplus now function on scarcity, which means they function differently, or stop functioning at all in the regions farthest from state supply chains. Children show it first, then the elderly, then the adults who had been carrying everyone else. Even if you find food today, there is no guarantee your body can still use it properly. The body under sustained stress becomes a different kind of problem. You do not need to encounter a plague to get sick in 536 AD. Your immune system has been quietly failing for months. Protein deficiency impairs the production of antibodies. Vitamin deficiencies, scurvy, rickets, pellagra, begin manifesting as physical symptoms: bleeding gums, joint pain, skin lesions, neurological disruption. These are not dramatic illnesses with clear trajectories. They are slow, chronic, and cumulative. They make everything else harder to survive. Water sources in late antique settlements are not isolated from waste. Latrines, animal enclosures, and water collection points coexist at close range in most agricultural communities. In normal conditions, the community's immune competence is sufficient to manage the pathogen load. Under famine conditions, that competence collapses. Waterborne illness, dysentery, typhoid, spreads more easily through a population that cannot mount a proper immune response. A disease that would cause a week of sickness in a well-fed adult becomes fatal in a malnourished child. Skeletal analysis from burial sites associated with this period shows characteristic patterns. Harris lines on long bones, indicating repeated growth interruptions during childhood. Dental enamel hypoplasia, indicating periods of systemic stress. Bone density loss, consistent with nutritional deficiency. These are not the bones of people who died in battle. These are the bones of people who spent years absorbing punishment from their environment and eventually ran out of capacity to absorb more. You do not fall sick dramatically. You weaken incrementally. And one morning, something minor finishes what the winter started. And then there is something no one was naming out loud. It begins with the children no one can feed. Not children who are simply hungry. That is visible. That is acknowledged. That generates collective response in most human communities. This is different. These are infants born into households that have already calculated, with the cold logic of people with nothing left to calculate, that they cannot sustain one more life. The archaeological evidence from this period and the centuries around it, burial sites, legal records, ecclesiastical legislation, points toward the same convergence. The practice of infant abandonment rises sharply during famines, not as an act of cruelty, as an act of arithmetic. Byzantine law in this period formally prohibited the practice while simultaneously creating legal frameworks for the absorption of abandoned children into servile labor, as if the legislation knew what it was actually governing. Church records describe foundling deposits at the entrances of monasteries and basilicas. The logic is not monstrous from the inside. It is the logic of triage. A household with 3 children and food for 2 makes a decision that the modern world does not want to look at directly, but that the historical record forces us to acknowledge. What makes this the hidden pressure of 536 AD is that it is not external. It is not the cold, the ash, the failed harvest, the tax collector. It is the internal fracture of the social unit that is supposed to be the last line of protection. The family. When famine runs long enough, the family itself becomes a site of impossible decisions, and those decisions leave traces. In legislation designed to regulate what was already happening. In burial patterns. In the quiet math of households that shrank by one and did not record why. You do not condemn them. You understand them. And that understanding is its own kind of weight. The emperor in Constantinople issues edicts. He reduces tax obligations in affected provinces, partially, temporarily, with exceptions and conditions attached. The edicts arrive months after the need is acute. By the time the administrative machinery produces a response, the crisis has already moved to a new phase. This is not incompetence. It is the structural speed of a pre-industrial bureaucracy managing a disaster across hundreds of miles, using messengers on horseback and documents copied by hand. Local authority fills the gap, or tries to. Landowners with grain stores become the effective government in their regions. They distribute food on their own terms, in exchange for labor, in exchange for land rights surrendered, in exchange for legal status renegotiated downward. The crisis that begins as an environmental event becomes a legal event. Free farmers with small independent holdings enter into dependency arrangements to survive. The terminology shifts. They are no longer smallholders. They are clients, tenants, laborers. The land they worked under one legal framework is now worked under another. The famine does not just kill people, it restructures property. For those who hold no leverage at all, the landless, the displaced, the urban poor who depend on market supply chains, the legal system offers nothing. Byzantine law in this period is elaborate and sophisticated for property disputes among the propertied. For a person with nothing to dispute, it is simply absent. You cannot appeal to a court that does not consider your survival a legal matter. The code does not discriminate, the law does. Women in this world do not survive the same crisis the same way. The food distribution logic of a household under scarcity is not egalitarian. It is hierarchical, calibrated around who contributes the most productive labor and who can be maintained at the lowest caloric cost. Adult men performing heavy agricultural work receive priority in caloric allocation, not because of deliberate cruelty, but because the household's survival depends on their output capacity. Women and children absorb a disproportionate share of the deficit. Skeletal evidence from famine-era burial sites in the late antique Mediterranean shows higher rates of nutritional stress markers in female remains than in male remains from the same contexts. This is not statistical noise. It is the biological record of a food distribution pattern that responded to scarcity by narrowing allocation toward productive male labor. Women who are pregnant or nursing require higher caloric intake precisely when the household has less to give. The outcome is documented in burial patterns: elevated female mortality in the middle reproductive years, elevated infant mortality in the same households. Widowhood, in this context, is not primarily a social condition. It is an economic vulnerability. A woman who loses her husband during a famine loses her household's primary labor claim on whatever resources remain in the community. She enters a hierarchy of dependency on relatives, on the church's charitable networks, on landowners who will accept labor for food that offers no stable floor. The charitable infrastructure of the early church was real and active. It was also insufficient at the scale of a multi-year continental agricultural failure. You survive the cold, you survive the hunger, but whether you survive the structure around you depends on where you stand inside it. By 539 AD, the harvests have still not recovered. The cascade by then is no longer theoretical. Trading networks that connected regional food surpluses to regional deficits have collapsed under 3 years of universal shortage. There are no surpluses to move. Urban populations dependent on long-distance grain supply have contracted sharply. Cities that functioned as economic centers have shed population to the countryside, where at least proximity to land offers the theoretical possibility of subsistence. The countryside has absorbed this migration poorly because the countryside has nothing either. The monetary economy in affected regions seizes up. When grain is worth more than silver, silver stops being a reliable medium of exchange. Barter re-emerges not as a primitive throwback, but as the only functional system left. The tax infrastructure, which was already straining, loses its revenue base. The armies that revenue sustained become smaller, or unpaid, or both. The borders they were supposed to hold become more permeable. Religious authority steps into some of the vacuum. Bishops in this period function as administrators as much as spiritual figures, managing grain distribution from church stores, negotiating with local landowners, absorbing displaced populations into ecclesiastical landholdings. The church becomes, in parts of the late antique world, the most functional institution remaining. This expansion of ecclesiastical authority is not ideological. It is logistical. When everything else fails, the organization with stored resources and a network of local nodes becomes the de facto government of survival. And then, in 541 AD, the plague arrives. A population already depleted by 5 years of nutritional stress has no reserve of immune competence to meet it. The plague of Justinian kills with a speed and scale that a healthy population might have partially absorbed. This one cannot. The demographic collapse that follows is not a separate catastrophe. It is the biological conclusion of everything that came before. A system that had been failing incrementally, finally reaching its terminal arithmetic. People did not stop. This is the part that resists easy description, because it looks nothing like the resilience in stories. There are no dramatic reversals here, no moments of collective triumph, no leaders who found solutions. What happened is smaller and more durable than that. People adjusted what they expected from a day. They reduced the definition of a good day until it fit inside what was actually available. A family that had stored grain for 6 months now stored for 3. A community that had planted 2 crops now planted 1, and hedged it with every wild edible the surrounding landscape could provide. Roots, bark, acorns, plants that were technically food, if you were hungry enough. Diets that Byzantine physicians would have considered degraded became the standard diet of functional households. The body, under sufficient pressure, accepts things the mind resists. Communities reorganized their labor around collective survival rather than household productivity. Extended family networks absorbed individuals whose immediate households had collapsed. Monastic communities, which operated on a communal resource model, became anchors for displaced populations in ways their founders had not intended. The flexibility was not heroic. It was the minimum adaptation necessary to prevent total dissolution. Somewhere in the middle of the second failed harvest, a farmer in what is now Turkey plants rye in a field where wheat had always grown. Rye tolerates cold and poor soil better. It is not a decision born of agricultural science. It is a decision born of watching wheat fail twice and having rye seeds left from a neighbor who died. That farmer's household survives the winter. The next one, too. Not because the world got easier, because the target moved. When the history books remember 536 AD, they tend to reach for superlatives. Worst year in human history, coldest decade in 2 millennia, the year that broke the ancient world. These are accurate. They are also incomplete. What 536 AD reveals is not simply the fragility of a particular civilization at a particular moment. It reveals the invisible architecture of every civilization, the interlocking systems of food, labor, climate, law, and social hierarchy that function without acknowledgement in good times and become visible only when they fail. The people of that world did not understand what had happened to their sky. They experienced the consequences in their bodies long before any explanation arrived. They made decisions, many of them devastating, inside a system that had been designed for a world that no longer existed. The distance between their world and yours is measured in insulation, in refrigeration, in global supply chains, in weather forecasting, in seed banks, in international emergency response frameworks. That insulation is real. It took centuries to build. It is also thinner than it appears from inside it. What 536 AD does not let you forget is that the sky does not negotiate. When it changes, you change or you don't. Most people in that world changed as fast as they could. It wasn't always fast enough. If you were dropped into 536 AD right now, not as a scholar, not as an observer, but as a body that needed to eat by nightfall, how long do you think you would last? Leave your answer in the comments. The range of responses usually reveals more about the present than about the past. If this kind of history interests you, subscribe. The next period we reconstruct will not be easier than this one.